Does God exist? That is the question. Is there any way to prove the existence of God? Well, if there was, atheists wouldn't exist. How much time did Jesus spend trying to convince people that God exists? 0. That's because Jesus' main audience was first century Jewish, meaning they were saturated in the myths and legends of not only their own God, but also that of the Greeks, Romans, and Persians. All their education, entertainment, and government were anchored on the idea that God exists. They really didn't have a choice of not believing in the existence of God. So Jesus never had to argue the existence because no one ever doubted. The issue wasn't, does God exist? It was, which God should we worship? And if you think about it, it's no different today, even for atheists. And I'll explain later. Back to Jesus and who he taught. Judaism is founded on what's called the law of Moses, which was given to Moses by God. That's why it's sometimes also called God's law. Which God? The same God that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob worshipped. However, even though Jewish people worshipped the same God as Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses, those 4 were not Jewish. Therefore, they did not practice Judaism. But also, they did not practice Christianity either. Abraham was most likely a Babylonian. Isn't that interesting? Therefore, Abraham most likely practiced the Babylonian religion, which was greatly influenced by the Sumerian religion, which was the first literate civilization of ancient Mesopotamia, with writings that go as far back as 3,500 BCE, or 5,500 years ago. Right, the oldest Hebrew text in existence only goes back to the 1st century. So it's most likely that the Sumerian religion and the Babylonian religion greatly influenced the Jewish tradition. Even though Abraham didn't practice Judaism, Islam, or Christianity, he is credited for being the foundation for all 3 religions. 3 of the world's biggest religions are founded on a Babylonian man who didn't even practice the religions that he supposedly founded. Now let's talk about the ancient world, right? The time in which Abraham lived. Back then, those cultures and traditions believed and worshipped multiple gods. Each god represented something, such as the sun or the sea, even things like archery or music, poetry, prophecy, medicine, fire, wine, agriculture, the underworld, war, love, the moon, wisdom, and even sleep, just to name a few. What made Abraham's God different than any of those gods, different than any of the Babylonian or Sumerian gods? Well, not much. Abraham's God is actually very similar to that of the other gods in the ancient world, right? For example, there's one called Anu, which was the supreme god of creation who lived in the heavens. Okay? Now, all the gods were believed to be his offspring. Do you see the similarity there? Right? The God of Abraham was also known to be the one who created the universe and all the other gods. He also lived in heaven. Another example is the god Enlil, who is the chief of all gods. The Sumerians envisioned Enlil as a benevolent and fatherly figure who watches over humanity and cares for their well-being. Again, sounds very familiar. He was eventually paralleled to Marduk, the chief god for the Babylonians, who influenced Abraham. God the Father isn't a purely Jewish or Christian theology, right? We can see it came way before that. Which leads me to believe that Judaism, Islam, Christianity are all evolutions and variants of older pagan religions that have existed since the beginning of human spirituality. In the ancient world, there was a God for everything. The existence of gods gave explanation to things that couldn't be explained. For the Sumerians, Egyptians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Hebrews, Greeks, Romans, a belief in a God was second nature. Not believing in God wasn't even an option. So, of course, this ancient Hebrew book that we call the Bible was inspired by all of these ancient cultures and traditions. Of course, it was going to incorporate a divine being in its narrative. Right? It didn't know how not to. That's why the Old Testament, if you notice, never argues the existence of God. Right? It only ever argues that Abraham's God was better than all the others. Right? Now, this also continues into the New Testament. The New Testament never argues the existence of God. Right? It only argues that God's heavenly kingdom is better than any of the earthly kingdoms, particularly Rome. However, Rome is really just a symbol for human greed and selfishness, which is also symbolized by Egypt, Babylon, and Syria, or any oppressive power structure. So, how did Abraham begin his journey as the father of three world religions? Well, it all started in Genesis. God said, Abraham will certainly become a great and mighty nation, and his influence will be a blessing to all the world. I have chosen him specifically so that he could teach his descendants how to live justly and righteously. If he fulfills his part of the covenant, I will fulfill mine. Did you catch that? The only responsibility God gave to Abraham was to teach justice and righteousness. Right? That's it. Not to convince people that God exists. There is a difference. That teaching would then influence the world, and in that way, Abraham would be a blessing to the world. One could say Abraham's God was the God of justice, right? Because God's all represents something. Now, if we read in the Psalms, righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne, speaking to God. Unfailing love and truth walk before you as attendants. You see the picture there. Abraham chose to believe and worship the God of justice instead of the gods of war, money, sex that were made out of wood or metal. Right? Abraham was a Babylonian. He believed in multiple gods, but he only chose to serve one. Do you see what's happening here? Right? Jesus said, no one can serve two masters, for you will hate one and love the other. You will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and be enslaved to money. Right? Jesus equates money to God in their influence. Jesus understood what God was. He saw God as the opposite of greed. Jesus saw that love of money was so powerful and influential that it was as much a God as any other divine being. Right? Abraham's God was different. Right? In order to worship his God, you had to behave and act justly and righteously. It wasn't enough just to offer sacrifices to it or have an idol of it on your mantle. Abraham's God doesn't even have a name. The closest thing to a name is when God told Moses to call him, I am what I am. But Moses could not have said that because he himself isn't God. So he would have had to have said, He is who he is. But then again, God didn't give himself a gender, so he would have had to said, it is what it is. But that just sounds weird. And there's another translation for I am what I am. You could also say was, is, and will be. God is just reality. That's not a name though. God doesn't have a name and he doesn't have an image, meaning he is not a noun or an adjective, right? Leaving only a verb. God is justice in action, right? Jesus' mission and ministry has never been, nor is it currently, nor will it ever be about convincing people that God exists. Try and find one verse in the Bible where Jesus is trying to convince another person to believe in God or to join his religion. You won't. Because Jesus wasn't preaching and teaching religion. In fact, religion is what crucified him, right? He was teaching justice and righteousness. Do you see the resemblance between Jesus and Abraham? Right? They were both not teaching religion. They were both simply teaching others how to treat their neighbor right. Now, theoretically, if Jesus was preaching religion, he would have been preaching Judaism because he was a Jew and he died being a Jew. Right? He never converted to Christianity. Right? Christianity is simply Jesus' version of Judaism. All right? Jesus taught the Torah. Now, Paul never tried to convert Gentiles into being Jews. He simply taught justice and righteousness towards one another. The definition of being a Christian, if you don't know, is to follow Christ, right? Jesus Christ. But to follow Jesus doesn't mean to believe in God. I'll let that sink in. Right? It only means believing in the teachings of Jesus, which are all about treating your neighbor right. Jesus teaches us not to oppress and to stop those who are oppressing. And that's it. And that's all God asked Abraham to do. That's all God asked Moses to do. That's all God spoke through the prophets to tell Israel to do. That's all the Bible is about. Abraham taught his descendants all about justice, and they taught their descendants all about justice. That's how Abraham blesses the world. Now, similarly, Jesus taught his disciples all about justice, and then they teach their disciples all about justice. And that continues. That's how Jesus blesses or saves the world. Unfortunately, modern Christianity is too busy arguing the existence of God rather than demonstrating and teaching justice. That's why Christianity is getting nowhere today, because it's arguing something that is meaningless here. Right? Believing in a God doesn't make you a better person. Why are atheists better Christians, better Christ followers than most Christians who believe in God? Because believing in God isn't the point here. And I'm not being heretical. Just read the Bible, right? Read the Old Testament, read the New Testament. It doesn't matter. That's not what the issue is. The issue isn't does God exist or not. It's how are you treating your neighbors? And if you do believe in God, which God are you serving? Right? Justice, love, or money, power, influence, sex, whatever else is controlling you. Right? What are you serving? That's the question. Others or only yourself? I want to repeat that one more time because it's very important to understand. Modern Christianity is too busy arguing the existence of God rather than demonstrating and teaching justice, which, by the way, is the only way you can be loyal and faithful to God. If you believe in him or her, whatever you prefer. They're both correct, but also both wrong, because he is neither, or he is all of it. That's a different video. So stop wasting your time trying to prove God's existence. That's not what's important here. Stop trying to defend Christianity or whatever religion you believe in, and start defending the poor, the marginalized, the refugee, and all those oppressed by society. Right? Start defending justice and righteousness, because that is the only way to walk in the way of the Lord, whether you believe in him or not.